I wanted to give some personal reflections on CBT from the perspective of how do we pull all of this together. I kind of feel in this last week I've opened up the hornet's nest in terms of the critical analysis of CBT. I hope you've had a chance to watch Brian's presentation and read his article where he's highly critical of CBT and brings forward a number of good arguments. So many people have very strong feelings about a number of different sort of aspects related to CBT. And at the end of the day, we kind of have to pull it all together in some way that we can go out into our clinical practices and work with our clients in a way that's meaningful. So I thought I'd share a little bit with you about kind of how I put it together. I came to like CBT probably back in the mid-90s. I had been exposed to it in my undergraduate degree. We had a professor by the name of Miles Buckman who really challenged us on a lot of our thinking around sort of traditional social work perspectives. And we had very sort of heated discussions in his class, but it really caused us to kind of pause and think about some of the assumptions that we were making about how human behavior worked. At that point in time, social work was so strongly influenced by psychodynamic therapy that it was perceived as pretty much the only way of looking at the world. And if you were critical of psychodynamic therapy, the assumption was that there was something psychologically wrong with you, that your failure to understand its brilliance was a result of your own internal defense mechanisms, as opposed to sort of a logical argument. So it made it difficult, I think, to look at other ways of looking at the world. Because it was so strongly held. But in the mid-90s, I moved to Penticton and became involved in more clinical counseling with clients. And I found this process of engaging clients in sort of kind of long discussions with the hope that they would gain insight to be something that either I wasn't very good at it, or it didn't work very well, or whatever, but it just wasn't a really good fit. And we were playing around at the time with a thing they called biodots. And these biodots were small little dots you would place on your skin, and they would change color in conjunction with your skin temperature. So kind of like the mood rings. And so when you were more relaxed, the dot would go blue or green, and when you're more tense, the dot would stay black. And so we were playing around with this, and I was wearing them while I was doing sessions with clients. And what I realized that I was in a more relaxed state when I was working with clients around sort of a cognitive perspective of a situation. So it struck me that I should pursue more about sort of a cognitive way of working with clients. The other thing I found was this Podesky's 7-column worksheet. And when I began using that with clients, I found that clients just moved much more quickly from point A to point B. Now, CBT doesn't use the language of insight. Insight is sort of the domain of psychodynamic therapy. But the reality is when a client discovers an automatic thought and they're able to come up with a balancing thought, in one sense, they've gained insight. And so I found the process of the 7-column worksheet took a client from not understanding their issue to a position of insight. And a client was able to move from A to B just so much more quickly than anything I could do in terms of this kind of ongoing psychodynamic kind of dialogue that I was having. That just may be because I wasn't good at it, but it just seemed to me that a cognitive perspective was much more helpful in terms of what worked for me and my ability to help clients. I also had trouble with psychodynamic therapy um, because it tended to have kind of an internal logic that was consistent internally, but it didn't allow itself to be questioned from the outside. So, for example, if you were to say you were uncomfortable with psychodynamic therapy, you would be told that you, or it would be implied anyways, that maybe you hadn't done your own psychological work, that you had junk in your trunk, that your defense mechanisms were preventing you from seeing the truth of psychodynamic therapy. And so these kind of criticisms are kind of hurtful if you see yourself as somebody who likes to be logical and think clearly about things. Now, the flip is also true, that when CBT therapists are critical of psychodynamic therapists, they're often quite insulting as well, and will accuse them of lacking research. And in the early days, that was true. The psychodynamic therapists weren't that interested in research. But now, as research has come out, there's no reason to say that psychodynamic therapy isn't supported in the research. But what I saw in my colleagues is this kind of hypothesis generation. Now, in CBT, we do that as well. We want to generate a hypothesis. But one of the principles in CBT of hypothesis generation is that you're always questioning the accuracy of the hypothesis. Psychodynamic therapy doesn't include that. There isn't a process by which you test these hypotheses, because in many ways the hypotheses are untestable. So, for example, when we say that depression is the result of suppressed anger, that's a common belief in psychodynamic therapy. But how do you go about testing that? How do you go out with a client and see if that's actually the dynamic that's leading to their depression? So I saw my colleagues kind of jumping on these kind of phrases and explanations, but not having any way of challenging it. And the downside I saw this, and I wouldn't say this is would hopefully be true. I don't think this would hopefully be true of clinicians that were proficient in psychodynamic therapy. But clinicians had a tendency to kind of come up with things that were just all over the map to explain a client's behavior. Once you can say there's this sort of unconscious process out there, then you can explain behavior by anything. You can just sort of come up with whatever. And often it sounds very logical, but again, it's not testable. And it just seemed to me a lot of these explanations were sometimes just kind of out there. So my concern that I have around psychodynamic therapy is that clinicians, if they don't have good supervision or good training or both, can come up with explanations about things that are really kind of out there. And they can kind of drift into this kind of sort of space where maybe it makes sense to them, and maybe even it makes sense to their client. But I have trouble with sort of the accuracy and authenticity of it. Anyways, so I mean that has led me to kind of become a big fan of CBT. I'm not a big fan of every piece of it. I really like the cognitive side of it, looking at thought distortions, helping clients look at situations differently that help them feel better. The behavioral stuff I think is really useful. Sometimes in cognitive behavioral therapy, the behavioral stuff gets sometimes a little bit off too. I think in one of the videotapes I talked about kind of the snapping of the elastic band, and I'm not sure why I included that, because I actually think that's a bit of a kind of an oddball thing to do. I've seen it help some clients, but I don't think it's that useful. I was reading one thing once on trichotillomania. I had a client with trichotillomania, and I was researching kind of interventions for that. And one researcher had come up with trichotillomania is where people start pulling out their hair, and they often have huge bald patches in their head because they've just, over time just pulled out a lot of their hair. And so one of his interventions was for these clients to wear cooking mitts, that'd be fine while you're wearing them, but I mean, who can live their life wearing cooking mitts all day? So it sort of had a pragmatic side to it, but it just seemed horribly unrealistic. Now, at the same time, when I researched the psychodynamic information on working with trichotillomania, they had long sort of discussions about the meaning of hair, the symbolism of hair, particularly for women, tracing it back to the Greeks. And hair is a sign of power, and the reason people are pulling out their hair is because they lack power in the world. And for me, that stuff just gets a little far-fetched, and there may be some truth to it, but at the end of the day, I don't find that particularly helpful or useful with a client. So again, sometimes you can see these things on the psychodynamic side that aren't useful, and sometimes on the behavioral side too. Things can get a little bit quirky. I think some of the criticisms around CBT that are worth looking at are its applicability sort of outside of kind of that middle class dominant society. CBT has been developed largely for with some kind of a white Caucasian population, middle class, upper middle class. And so there's a lot we don't know about how well it applies cross-culturally. And obviously there's pieces of it that don't apply. So for example, if you're working in a cultural group where storytelling is very important, there'll be some rub between Judith Beck's direction to interrupt clients. Sometimes culturally that would be perceived as quite rude. And so there's sort of some issues there. So the question then becomes, well, does that mean CBT shouldn't be pursued cross-culturally, or is it just something that we have to learn about? Some people make the argument in such a way as to say that CBT would be invalid. And I see it more as that we just don't know enough about how do we apply it cross-culturally, and what do we need to learn to be able to do it. And also be open to the possibility that within certain cultural groups, it just doesn't fit their worldview. The other discussion that I see out there a fair bit is around the applicability of CBT to really complex situations. And usually people in the argument bring up trauma. I personally see no issue there. In fact, I think CBT helps us break down complex problems into manageable bits and bytes. And CBT has protocols around working with post-traumatic stress disorder. I think some of its conceptualization around what trauma is, how it works in the brain, I think are very solid. And so when people say, well, I wouldn't use CBT with somebody with trauma, I'm really curious about what they would do. And so I think, I don't see sort of a better alternative. And I'm actually quite excited about some of the direction and research that CBT is finding out around trauma. I think one of the arguments that's worth sort of listening to has to do with differences between clients. CBT has good, solid research behind it, but it doesn't mean it works for everybody. And the researchers and people who follow CBT know that it's not 100% cure. Success rates can be good for certain populations, but there seems to be groups of people that don't benefit from it. And so is this the model itself? Is there a problem with how the model matches the client's worldview? And would there be sort of a better model? Or does it just speak to the complexities of the clinical problems that people have? It's a bit of, I think almost an, I don't know, arrogant might be too strong of a word, but this notion that we can sit down with somebody and have a discussion with them, and at the end of that discussion they're going to be healed of the problems that they have. I'm not sure talk therapy is that powerful, and I'm not sure talk therapy will ever be that powerful. I think, but I think the future will really be about how do we make better matches between the types of interventions that we're doing and the nature of that individual client. And I suspect the piece that will become more important is client choice. The clients right at the beginning may be able to tell us, CBT isn't going to fit for me, or psychodynamic therapy is going to fit better for me. So I think, if I were to speculate what we're going to learn in the future, I think it's going to be along those lines. A lot of the criticisms that are laid against CBT are actually criticisms that could be applied to any type of individual therapy. I think there's a fundamental discussion around what is the role in individual therapy in terms of healing people, particularly in a context of the larger environmental influences. How does individual therapy fit in with social justice? How does individual therapy fit in terms of making social change? So, for example, we can think of an individual who, perhaps a First Nation person who's experienced a lot of racism in their life as a sequela to residential schools and colonization. What role does individual therapy with that individual have versus actions that are targeting more systemic issues like racism and colonization? So I think we have to kind of keep individual therapy within that sort of framework. And certainly as social workers, we always need to keep an eye to the larger issues and the bigger pictures. One of the things that I think is a potential for CBT in the hands of social workers is to start to make some of those larger links. We've looked at the case conceptualization from the perspective of a person's belief systems developing from early childhood events. But what about the impact of culture on an individual's belief systems? What about the impact of prejudice or racism or social forces that influence how we grow up and the kinds of things that we believe, and whether those beliefs are functional and useful in the particular context that we're living in? Can we affect social change from the perspective of looking at social beliefs, at societal beliefs? A fairly clear and common example is eating disorders. Eating disorders looks like it's a culturally bound condition predominant in Western culture. It's less present in other cultures, and it seems to be related to the beliefs that we have about attractiveness and beauty and weight and the messages that we give to young women about how they should look. And so we see the connection from these larger social beliefs on a particular individual and the development of specific disorders. Why can't we take this concept a little further? Can't we go beyond just sort of individual thought distortions? What about societal thought distortions? What is it we believe about working together? What is it we believe about supporting each other? What is it we believe about freedom and choice and personal liberty? And how do those beliefs then impact on the individual's ability to function? Can we target belief systems not just from an individual therapy perspective, but can we also target it from a larger systemic social perspective? So I think that discussion should also be in there somewhere, recognizing just the fundamental limitation of individual therapy, but also the applicability of CBT to a larger context. Anyways, I've been a little bit rambly here, but I hope it provides some useful thoughts for you, and it kind of helps you kind of pull some of these things together. So good luck to you, and good luck to you in your practice.